So you talked about culture sort of trumping everything. So within a 2-week period, I had 2 conversations with 2 extraordinary thought leaders. The first was Tony Hsieh, who's the CEO of Zappos. And have any of you in the room read his book, Delivering Happiness? If you haven't, you should. It's partly Tony's story, but it's mostly the story of how Zappos has created this incredible brand and this incredible culture where it's now, in terms of the number of applications and the number of hires, it's more difficult to get a job at Zappos than it is to get accepted to Harvard.
And where are they located?
In Henderson, Nevada. So I live in Las Vegas, so it was really easy to go over and say, hey, I want to talk to you. But Tony has said in his book and in many cases that when you ask him about the culture and you ask him about how he's made this sort of amazing organization happen and what would he do differently, every time he says, I would have focused on the culture first. We didn't get to really focusing on the culture until we figured it out. It was about 4.5 years into sort of this Zappos organization that's really sort of been like this big sort of culture lab experiment. And then 2 weeks later, I was at the HR Florida SHRM conference and sat at a master class with Dave Ulrich, who begins to talk, who's now sort of transforming some of his research, really looking at culture. And what both Dave and Tony say about the creation of culture that creates a brand that is persistent and attractive, a culture of engagement of employees, is a total focus on customer, on what you deliver to the customer. And Dave goes so far as to say, when you're doing culture work, it's nice to see what your employees think. It only matters what your customers think. And so Tony pretty much says the same thing. It's different language. But the Zappos culture was built to deliver happiness to the customers. And they broke the code, I think, by discovering how you create your culture and then how you populate the culture is only about delivering happiness to the customer. So everything they do in that culture, even though it feels very employee-focused, even though it's all, we read about the zany culture and delivering wow experience and creating fun and a little weirdness, that's actually one of their 10 corporate values. That's really not about the employees. It's really about the customers. And so I think, as we have these brand conversations and we have these recruiting conversations, bringing the customer perspective into it, and one of the examples Dave uses is the airline business. And who would want to actually be in the airline business these days? But you only have to take an airplane ride, sort of once a year to understand, we're probably not listening to the customers when it comes to our culture, when it comes to our brand, unless maybe you're JetBlue or maybe you're Southwest Airlines, because those cultures and those customer experiences are so radically different than the others, and the Zappos buying experience is so radically different than lots of other kinds of experiences. But so it's the focus on the customer to create a culture that engages employees to do what's right for the customer. And that may be part of kind of where we're missing the boat. When I have been a business leader and I've had positions that were open reporting to me and would work with my HR folks or would work with an outside third party, first place I go to is my customers. What do I need on my team that you don't see? What kind of skills have you wished we had? What kind of background have you wished I would go first to my customers before I'd go anywhere else, particularly in building a job spec. Is that nuts?
No.
Does that happen?
Well, I think it's happening more and more. If you see this idea of sort of co-creation taking off, Starbucks has done this well. Mm-hmm. I think Dell has done this a bit, and others. And a book I'll toss out there that I think is very relevant for the times is Clay Shirky's new book, Cognitive Surplus. Thank you. And what's interesting is that these social technologies are sort of coming together at this time when people are looking and seeking out these connections. And when they have the time to do it, because we've sort of come out of this sort of a dumbed down TV phase, if you will, and sorry to anybody associated with TV, but it's sort of like getting people off the couch and getting them more engaged, and whether that's through gaming or whether that's through social channels or whatever, people are figuring out how to self-organize and get stuff done. And smart companies are figuring out how to engage those customers, right, or those employees, or together, and it's now bringing into one conversation who your customer is, who your current employer, your prospective employee is, and potentially there's overlap there. And how do you sort of leverage that conversation to solve big problems? There's some really cool stuff going on with this right now. So when you bring it back to a talent acquisition perspective, how does that help you learn more about the type of people that are interested in your company? And how do you use some of those dynamics as potentially a recruitment tool? L'Oreal, the global cosmetics company, very smart about how they've created a game called eStrat, which is been able to make manufacturing sexy again, to get college students interested in their business by creating this game. And the students come, does it just smell like smoke in here? Sort of a little funky, but just saying.
That could be me, I don't know.
But
it's because you're so
I'll
hot.
move over a little.
But it was a partnership with Business Week. It's very, very smart. And those are the types of conversations that people are looking to get involved in. And whether they be customers, whether they be potential candidates, or potentially, do you even need to discern between those two groups?
Right.
What can you learn?
And I would say that the way that this all links together is that I don't know if you can really be doing social recruiting or developing social relationships with customers if you don't know what your culture is, if you don't have a story to tell that's real, if you're not able to say this is who we are, this is what we're here for, this is what our gift is, and this is how we own that shit. If you don't have that, I don't think it's social in nature, and most companies don't have that, and they haven't even practiced talking about their culture. They kind of ignore it because it's this intangible, abstract thing that's hard to measure and quantify and put on a shelf. But I think that's increasingly a valuable thing to do. I think that's one of the things that you do to set yourself apart. Whether you're doing it on Twitter or right here, the most powerful social technology that still exists on this planet, whether you're doing it right here, do you have a compelling story to tell? Or are you just blasting that same old shit out every day through every venue that you can find? That's not social. You might be using social tools, but there's nothing social about it. And more people are saying, thank you, no.
So you guys have done a lot of work around culture, both recently. So it'd be interesting to hear you just sort of comment a little bit about organizations that maybe don't have this embedded in their culture. Like, what are some things that they could begin to do so that they're more receptive to it, and if they can then take on a social strategy, would be more aligned with what is appropriate culturally for the times?
Well, I think you start with what Joe just said, is you have to understand your culture. And if you're going to do culture work, I'm going to agree with Dave Ulrich and Tony Hsieh. I think you start with what your customers want. I mean, if you're a business, you're in business to solve a customer need. If you're a nonprofit, you're there to serve a specific community. Everybody's got customers, right? And so you want to create a culture that's going to speak to and deliver what your customers really need. Now, the way you do that is by selecting the right people who are in alignment with those cultural values to help you build your product or build your service or whatever. What I find interesting, since we're talking recruitment here, at Zappos, their first filter, and somebody sort of discounted this earlier in one of the conversations, their first filter is culture. Before they ever talk to you about the skills or the job, they want to know, are you going to fit in here? Are we going to like working with you? And are you going to do the kinds of things that we expect that happen on a regular basis in our culture? And that's their first filter, which I find fascinating. And when you walk... So here's a couple other things about Zappos. They give 5 free hour-long tours of their headquarters every day. There are people that come to Vegas who are coming to gamble or see share or whatever, who also make time to go over to Zappos and take the free tour, to feel what it's like to be in that culture. Can you imagine having a culture so strong, so pervasive, that it's a tourist attraction, right? I mean, that's really a remarkable thing. And they're a successful business, right? They created an online retail business that surpassed $1 billion in gross sales, merchandise sales in less than 10 years. I mean, that's like a measure of success. They just went over 2,000 employees, I think, a couple months ago. So it's not a huge organization, and yet in the merchandising retail world, maybe one of the most powerful brands. You know, there's Nordstrom's and maybe there's Zappos, right? So I think the culture work happens first, and I don't think you have to be a 1,000-person employer. I think you could be a 20-person employer if you're focused on creating a culture that delivers to the customer what the customer needs. That's your guidepost. That's really your North Star. Mm-hmm.
I think in cultural work, to tie this back to kind of this element of social media, and I think sort of where we, on the social recruiting side, and even going back to the previous discussion about brand, is that, I mean, regardless of what our customers want from us at that point, the culture is what the people say it is, and the beauty of where we are in this point in time, and I think one of the really powerful things about social media is that it's made it, it's more transparent than ever. If you're willing to listen, you can go find out about what people think about your culture. You can, without even having to ask, you can go out into social media and you can do some discovery and some research, and you can find out. And I think that's where, I guess, if I bring it all the way back to, I think one of the messages that I started the day with is that if you're a recruiter and you don't see yourself as kind of one of the captains of the culture of your organization, you aren't paying attention, because that culture is your employer brand. And if you're out selling anything other than that actual experience and what people say it is, then you're lying to people. And
bringing in talent that is in direct conflict with what that culture is.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And that perpetuates longer term issues. And so I think underneath this whole social recruiting notion is that recruiters have to seize control, or at least get involved in the culture discussion, because it's so critically important that they're understanding and expressing what the culture is. And you know what? Sometimes you find out that you can't make that change, and you punch out and you go find a culture you want to recruit for. I mean, I think that was the personal brand, corporate brand discussion earlier, is that, yeah, they're both there. The trick is you got to have two that match up together. And if you're out of alignment, then fix it. Right. And there's a couple of options to do that. So.
And if that clarity of purpose is there, and that foundational logic and philosophy and all that stuff is in place, that's what makes the technology powerful. Right? Mm-hmm. Because then you can take that story out and you can tell it to more people, more better, and more often. I said more better out loud, but that's what makes the tools really, really powerful, when they're built on a solid foundation. When they're not on that, they're just not nearly as effective as they can be. The technology that we have, social technology, is incredibly powerful, but it's got to be built on, I believe, that foundational stuff, that core stuff.
And if it's real, your employees will tell the story, yep. And that story will drive people back to you. I mean, it will attract. That's what look at what's happening with Zappos and Southwest.
And you can be a culture captain. It's a new phrase for us today. Culture captain.
Well, and the technology is just it. The technology is going to enable you to do what you want to get done, and there's more risk in going out there and delving into social recruiting and social media without having this in place. And it's one thing if maybe it's aspirational, right? Mm-hmm. And you're transparent about that and how you're sharing it. But remember, this works both ways. So if you have candidates that are following you as recruiters that haven't received a response, and they see you all out on Twitter and you're out on Facebook and you're chatting away and there's all this other stuff going on, and they have yet to get their response back about the job they applied to, how's that working for your brand? I mean, that's going to be processed in a very powerful way by an individual.
Yeah. But if people have a compelling story to tell about the work that they do in the organization, they will carry it forward on their own.